Picture this: a man stands in his suburban driveway loading a minivan with soccer equipment, lunch boxes and car seats. His friends see him and think, "What a responsible guy. What a good father. What a complete man." Arthur Schopenhauer, the master of philosophical pessimism, calls this man a fool. Why? Because he lacks love for children? No. Because he doesn't understand how life actually works. If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Schopenhauer's answer was a resounding no. Here's the problem with having kids. You don't create happiness. You create suffering. You don't build a family. You build a prison. You don't become a man. You become a slave. And if you think having children is your purpose, Schopenhauer has something to tell you. Walk through any playground, any school pickup line, any family gathering, and you'll see them. Men who've confused biological impulse with conscious choice, duty with desire, social programming with personal calling. They change diapers at 3 o'clock a.m. and call it love. They work overtime to pay for daycare and call it responsibility. They sacrifice their dreams for their children's needs and call it maturity. And they think this makes them fulfilled. But Schopenhauer thinks otherwise. The will to live is the source of all suffering, and procreation is its most cunning trap. These men are victims of what Schopenhauer called the most sophisticated deception in human existence. They believe they chose to have children, when in reality biology chose for them. Here's what they don't realize. Every person watching this domestic drama is making calculations. The smart ones recognize the cage. The wise ones see the chains. The enlightened ones walk away entirely. Why? Because Schopenhauer says something about human nature that most men never grasp. We don't respect obvious sacrifice. We pity it. We don't admire willing slavery. We question it. We don't envy the overburdened. We avoid becoming them. And this misunderstanding leads to the first catastrophic mistake. The family man mistakes his burden for his purpose. He writes checks his happiness can't cash. He starts a war against his own interests that he can never win. Schopenhauer had a rule about this. Life is essentially suffering, and to create life is to multiply suffering. But the modern father violates this principle constantly. He brings consciousness into a world of pain, creates banks destined for disappointment, transforms his own existence into a machine for perpetuating misery. And when reality hits, it hits hard. All love is founded on sexual impulse, however ethereally it may bear itself. Here's the truth that destroys most men who have children. You didn't choose this life. Rather, you were seduced into it. That moment when you fell in love, when you got caught up in romance, when you started talking about our future together, you weren't making rational decisions. You were being manipulated by what Schopenhauer called the species trick for ensuring its continuation. Schopenhauer understood this perfectly. Nature achieves its ends through illusion. Love is the illusion that tricks individuals into serving the species. The man operates on emotion, not philosophy. He gets swept up in romantic fantasies and forgets to ask the fundamental questions. Do I actually want the responsibilities of parenthood? Am I prepared for the financial and emotional costs? Have I considered what I'll sacrifice for this choice? Is this decision based on reason or merely biological programming? And here's what he doesn't realize until it's too late. Every romantic decision is a philosophical choice where you can only lose your freedom. Best case scenario, you love your children but mourn your lost possibilities. Worst case, you resent your children and mourn your lost life. Because here's the dark truth about the reproductive impulse. It doesn't care about your happiness. It doesn't consider your dreams. It moves quietly, strikes precisely, and disappears before you realize you've been trapped. The person who actually has wisdom doesn't get caught in romantic delusions. They don't need to prove their love through procreation. They don't need to validate their relationship through reproduction. They don't need to be a parent to feel complete as a human being. And this is where having children becomes genuinely dangerous. You sacrifice your authentic. Hey buddy, you have watched to this point. We believe you found value from this video. Do well to subscribe to keep getting more amazing contents like this. Also, don't forget to like and click the hype button. Now let's continue our video. Sell for a role that society applauds but philosophy condemns. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. And if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free. Schopenhauer understood that freedom and parenthood are fundamentally incompatible. The moment you become responsible for another consciousness, you cease to be fully responsible to yourself. But the modern father does the opposite. He makes himself responsible for beings who will consume his resources, demand his attention, and monopolize his time for decades. He ensures that solitude becomes impossible, freedom becomes memory, and authentic choice becomes fantasy. And here's what happens when you become the eternally responsible one. You attract the attention of a universe that views you as a resource to be drained, not through love. That's the romantic lie. Through systematic extraction of your time, money, energy, and possibilities, the father becomes the focus of endless demands. His children need food, shelter, clothing, education, entertainment, emotional support, and constant supervision. His wife needs partnership, attention, validation, and shared domestic labor. Society needs him to be provider, protector, role model, and taxpayer. Meanwhile, he thinks he's winning because people call him responsible. He doesn't realize he's been systematically stripped of everything that made him an individual. Schopenhauer calls this the blindness of the will, the inability to see that apparent purpose often masks genuine enslavement. That obvious meaning often hides authentic meaninglessness. That social approval often precedes personal destruction. In a world of infinite demands on finite resources, every parental commitment becomes a chain. Every school event becomes obligation. Every family vacation becomes expensive duty. Every bedtime story becomes time stolen from your own thoughts. And everyone becomes dependent on you when you make yourself indispensable. People who might have been equals become burdens. Relationships that might have been voluntary become mandatory. Choices that might have been open become predetermined. This is what Schopenhauer meant by the suffering of attachment. When your happiness becomes hostage to other people's needs. When your peace depends on other people's satisfaction. When your freedom becomes other people's security, and the solution is never what the father expects. A man's delight in looking forward to and hoping for some particular satisfaction is a part of the pleasure flowing from it enjoyed in advance. But this is afterwards deducted. For the more we look forward to anything, the less we enjoy it when it comes. Here's the life-destroying truth about having children. The promise of legacy is philosophy's cruelest joke. You think you're creating something that will outlast you, honor your memory, carry forward your values. But what you're actually creating is more suffering disguised as continuity. Because legacy built on consciousness is built on quicksand. Your children will not remember you as you want to be remembered. They will not carry forward your dreams. They'll pursue their own. They will not honor your sacrifices. They'll take them for granted or resent them entirely. Schopenhauer captured this perfectly. Every individual, every human appearance is only another short dream of the endless spirit of nature. But the father operates from the opposite delusion that reproduction creates permanent meaning rather than temporary distraction from meaninglessness. Watch what happens to men who base their identity on their children. The successful businessman becomes Tommy's dad. His achievements become secondary to his parental role. His identity becomes hostage to beings who didn't ask to be born and may not even like him when they mature. The assumption that children will provide meaning is the inversion of philosophical truth. Real meaning comes from what you create, not what you procreate. Authentic legacy comes from ideas, not DNA. Genuine immortality comes from contributions to human understanding, not contributions to human population. And here's why this matters in practical terms. Your children will live their own lives. They'll move away, start their own families, pursue their own interests. The intensive period of hands-on parenting lasts roughly 18 years. The period of living with your choices lasts your entire life. So, you trade decades of freedom for decades of responsibility in hopes of creating relationships that may or may not survive your children's independence. Meanwhile, the man who chose philosophical development over biological reproduction has spent those same decades mastering skills, creating art, building businesses, exploring ideas, developing wisdom. Which life contains more authentic meaning? The man who spent 20 years changing diapers or the man who spent 20 years changing the world? All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only and never positive. Schopenhauer understood that what we call the joy of parenthood is really just relief from the anxiety of childlessness, an anxiety that society artificially creates and then offers children as the cure. But here's the economic reality that destroys the parenting fantasy. Children don't complete you financially. They bankrupt you systematically, not just in money, but in opportunity, flexibility, and choice. The father thinks he's investing in his family's future, but he's actually mortgaging his own present for an uncertain return that may never materialize. The life of every individual is really a tragedy, but gone through in detail. It has the character of a comedy. Consider the comedy of financial planning for children. You calculate college costs that will inflate faster than your ability to save. You budget for healthcare expenses that will multiply beyond your projections. You plan for activities and opportunities that will expand beyond your means. Meanwhile, the childless man invests the same money in appreciating assets, develops skills that increase his earning power, and maintains the flexibility to capitalize on opportunities that require quick decision-making. Who has more genuine security after 20 years? But the economic enslavement goes deeper than money. Children create what economists call path dependency. Each choice limits future choices. You can't move cities easily because of school districts. You can't change careers radically because of income stability requirements. You can't take entrepreneurial risks because of dependents who need security. The childless man maintains what Schopenhauer valued most: optionality. The freedom to change direction when new information emerges. The ability to pursue opportunities when they appear. The choice to prioritize experiences over obligations. This isn't selfishness, but rather philosophical consistency. If life is about conscious choice rather than biological programming, then maintaining choice becomes a moral imperative. All willing springs from lack, from deficiency, and thus from suffering. Here's Schopenhauer's most brutal insight. Every conscious being you create inherits the fundamental structure of existence, which is suffering punctuated by brief intervals of satisfaction. You're not giving the gift of life. You're imposing the burden of consciousness. Think about what you're actually doing when you have children. You're creating beings who will experience physical pain and illness, emotional disappointment and heartbreak, existential anxiety about death and meaninglessness, social rejection and professional failure, the gradual decay of aging and inevitable mortality. It would be better if there were nothing. Since there is more pain than pleasure on earth, every satisfaction is only transitory, creating new desires or new troubles. And the agony of the devoured animal is always far greater than the pleasure of the devourer. But somehow we've convinced ourselves that creating more consciousness is virtuous rather than cruel. The father looks at his sleeping child and feels love, not recognizing that he's guaranteed this innocent being will someday experience profound suffering, heartbreak, failure, loss, death simply by virtue of being conscious. And here's the philosophical question that destroys the parenting justification. If you had the choice between never existing or living a life containing both pleasure and pain, which would you rationally choose? You can't ask the unborn, but you can think honestly about your own experience. How much of your life has been genuine satisfaction versus various forms of dissatisfaction, anxiety, and suffering? Schopenhauer's point isn't that life contains no pleasure. It's that the pleasures don't justify the pains, and creating new beings guarantees both. The enlightened man recognizes that not creating consciousness is an act of compassion, not selfishness. You're sparing potential beings from guaranteed suffering. You're refusing to multiply the world's pain. You're choosing wisdom over biological compulsion. This is why the great philosophical traditions, Buddhism, Stoicism, various forms of asceticism, all recognize procreation as philosophically problematic. They understood what modern culture has forgotten. Creation of consciousness is creation of suffering. A man can do what he ought to do, but he cannot will what he ought to will. Schopenhauer understood that most of our desires aren't genuinely our own. They're implanted by social forces that benefit from our choices, even when we don't. And nowhere is this more obvious than with the social pressure to have children. From birth, society programs you to see parenthood as inevitable destiny rather than optional choice. You get toy trucks and are told you'll be a provider someday. You see movie heroes who fight for their families. You hear endless messaging about carrying on the family name. But this programming serves society's interests, not your own. Society needs workers, taxpayers, consumers, and soldiers. It needs people willing to sacrifice personal fulfillment for social stability. It needs individuals who will prioritize group continuation over individual development. The masses are nothing but copies poorly executed. The man who has children because it's what people do isn't making a philosophical choice. He's executing social programming. He's becoming a copy of previous generations rather than an original expression of his own consciousness. And here's what Schopenhauer knew about social conformity. It's the enemy of authentic wisdom. When you do what everyone else does, you get what everyone else gets. A life of quiet desperation disguised as normal responsibility. The truly philosophical man questions the basic assumptions. Why should I reproduce? What do I personally gain from parenthood? How does having children serve my authentic development? What would I do with my life if I ignored social expectations entirely? These questions terrify most people because they reveal the emptiness beneath social programming. They show how much of what we call natural is actually manufactured consent to serve systems that don't care about individual flourishing. The wise man recognizes that social pressure and philosophical truth often point in opposite directions. Society wants you to have children because it needs future participants. Philosophy suggests you shouldn't have children because consciousness is suffering. Society tells you that parenthood is fulfilling. Philosophy reveals that fulfillment comes from wisdom, not reproduction. Society promises that children give meaning to life. Philosophy demonstrates that meaning comes from understanding, not creating dependence. Choose philosophy over sociology. Choose consciousness over conformity. Choose your own authentic development over society's reproductive requirements. The wise man is one who knows what he is and what the world is. The man who understands what he is doesn't need children to validate his existence. The man who understands what the world is doesn't want to force new consciousness into it. Here's what changes when you stop seeing parenthood as mandatory and start seeing it as optional. You become more authentic, not less. More fulfilled, not less. More wise, not less. Because real fulfillment doesn't need to reproduce itself. It shows up in your work. It appears in your relationships. It manifests in your understanding. People sense genuine fulfillment the way they sense genuine wisdom. Not because you tell them about it, but because they experience it in interaction with you. Not because you prove it through procreation, but because you demonstrate it through the depth of your being. And here's what Schopenhauer knew about lasting impact. The greatest contributions to humanity don't come from fathers. They come from philosophers, artists, scientists, innovators. People who dedicated themselves fully to understanding or creating rather than reproducing. The names we remember across centuries aren't dead. They're Plato, Shakespeare, Newton, Nietzsche. Men who transcended biology through intellect. Men who left legacies of thought, not children. Men who understood that wisdom outlives DNA by orders of magnitude. The ordinary father leaves descendants who will be forgotten within 3 generations. The extraordinary philosopher leaves insights that shape civilizations. Which is the higher calling? Which is the greater act of love for humanity? Which is the more authentic path to meaning? If suffering is the structure of consciousness, then reducing the multiplication of suffering is compassionate. If wisdom is the highest human capacity, then dedicating your life to it is noble. Schopenhauer saw fatherhood not as an accomplishment, but as a failure of philosophy. A capitulation to biology, a surrender to programming. He saw wisdom as the true purpose of life. To understand, to see clearly, to pierce the illusions that enslave the masses. And this is why his writings remain both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because they strip away comforting illusions. Liberating because they offer a way to live authentically without submitting to biological compulsion. And here's where most men go wrong. They read Schopenhauer and think, so you're saying I should never have kids? That's not the point. The point is to understand what you're doing when you choose to reproduce, to see it clearly, without illusions, to recognize that you're creating no consciousness condemned to suffer, not fulfilling a noble destiny, to recognize that you're serving social programming, not philosophical truth. Once you see that clearly, you're free to make an authentic choice, rather than a program one.